at the rear of the house. The second axis, in red, extending from the front door to an attention-focusing device such as a fountain or a statue niche at the very rear of the structure, serve to create a visceral desire in visitors to secure an invitation into the luxurious private section of the house surrounding the peristyle. As such, peristyles acted as special spaces with tightly controlled access. And owners worked in concert with artists, architects, and sculptors to create an atmosphere designed to impress guests. The owner of the house of Octavius Quartio engaged in a major expansion of the property that included the amplification of the private section of the house, which you can see here in the bottom of the slide, and in the reconstruction, this portion that extends outwards. This expansion consisted in the incorporation of a number of features often found in the seaside villas of the super wealthy, such as reflecting pools, sculpture pavilions, artificial waterways, fountains, and extensive walled gardens. In essence, the owner of the domus followed a popular trend of providing a bit of countryside in the city, what the Romans called rus in urbe. At first glance, the artistic program in the house of Octavius Quartio seems to be a jumbled quotation in miniature of these elements of popular villa culture, an unsophisticated aping of the culture of the super wealthy. These elements that we should take note of include, at F, a possible shrine to the goddess Isis with Isiac imagery. At location H, a triclinium or dining room with scenes from the life of Hercules and the Iliad. Located here, beyond the dining room, a Euripus or reflecting pool with a companion sculpture garden that surrounded it. An upper idicula or fountain with a grotto dedicated to the goddess Diana, and an enormous lower garden containing an artificial stream and another fountain. Rather than dismissing this space as a jumbled hodgepodge, or as one scholar has called it, a crude Disneyland version of elite culture, we should instead see it as a complicated and compact set of interlocking sensory experiences that explicitly reflect elements of contemporary literary culture. As I previously mentioned, aristocrats often work to turn private sections of their villas into spaces of extreme luxury that operated beyond the harsh constraints and cares of daily life. In the case of the house of Octavius Quartio, the owner sought to activate a pair of literary topoi, the Aurea Aetas, or Golden Age, and the Locus Amoenus, or a setting in an idealized countryside. Much poetry written during the 1st century BC had focused on a similar escapist basis. Poets such as Virgil and Horace constructed worlds rooted in an idealized rusticity, in which a virtuous mankind still operated outside the bounds of contemporary society. Heroes and heroines occupying idyllic settings, Loci Amoeni, lived out their lives without the complications of political infighting, civil wars, or the crushing burdens of surviving urban life. The architects of the house of Octavius Quartio actively sought to provide a locus amoenus for visitors to the private section of the house. The gardens and the water features tapped into the literary cachet of such spaces and allowed visitors to release the concerns of ordinary life and occupy the mythological world of these stories. In addition, for the Greeks and Romans, myths operated not in the time of reality, but they form part of an other time, not connected to the real progression of days, weeks, and years. The poet Hesiod had articulated this as early as the 8th century BC in his temporal schema associated with the philosophical concept of a regressive anthropology. For Hesiod, humanity was moving forward in an increasingly difficult and depraved series of eras, departing from the ideals of a lost golden age under the rule of Saturn. I jokingly thought about adding kind of like 2020. I'll refrain from making that joke now that I've already made it. Roman poets and artists working within the propaganda program of the Augustan regime had suggested that this era of Saturn had been reborn in the guise of the Pax Augustana, enacted following nearly 100 years of civil war in the Roman Republic. The theme shows up prominently in the Areopagus, replete with fertility images, such as the goddess Tellus in the upper image, and lush vegetal reliefs highlighting natural abundance, as we see in the lower image. What the Areopagus articulated in stone relief in the capital, the architects of the house of Octavius Quartio designed in reality in Pompeii. As a visitor entered into the private space, they were greeted with a lush view of the lower garden and the artificial stream across the upper nymphaeum. And you can see that same view as we look at it from the slide. The presence of a pair of muses here at positions 11 and 12 clued the visitor into the fact that they had left reality and had entered the artificial world of mythology and poetry. This assumption was confirmed visually with images of Diana and Actaeon, which flanked the nymphaeum and conflated the transgressive experience of Actaeon with their own. Like the ill-fated hunter, the visitor saw what was a plausible locus for the fateful bath of Diana that led to the hunter's demise. And Diana and Actaeon show up here at locations E and F, and they show up again on the walls at locations J and K below the fountain that we're looking at here, where there's a pool that collects water from that fountain. Let's turn to the space now located at the end of the Euripus, or reflecting pool. Here, there was a small outdoor dining room with a pair of low benches, a biclinium. Frescoes elsewhere in Pompeii, for example, in the House of the Chaste Lovers and in the House of the Triclinium, suggest that these spaces were used for banquets and conversations of lovers. They were spaces where people idled away time, and they provided an apt setting for taking in the artistic program in the context of the architecture of the garden and the reflecting pool. Lucius, the fresco painter, took advantage of this opportunity for sustained contemplation and chose a pair of myths which intersected and interacted in sensorially powerful ways with the other elements of the space. Given the subject matter of the scene to the right, here, the tale of Pyramus and Thisbe, we can be certain that the author's source was that of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and the painter integrated several features of Ovid's text into the experience of taking in the image. Ovid's was the first account in Latin of what had been an exceedingly rare myth in Greek literature as well. The myth of Pyramus and Thisbe is one of star-crossed lovers. The useful couple lived in adjacent houses, but their love was forbidden by their parents. Frustrated at their attempts to interact, the couple decided to run away. They developed a plan and escaped the city under cover of darkness, and to meet in the cemetery near a tomb and fountain. Thisbe arrived first, but encountered a lioness fresh from a kill and fled, leaving her cloak behind. When Pyramus arrived, he saw the blood-soaked lioness in the cloak of his lover, and fearing the worst, he took his own life. Thisbe returned shortly thereafter to find her lover dead. Rather than face life alone, Thisbe joined Pyramus in suicide. We should know in particular the features of Ovid's description. And so, as not to wind up wandering those open spaces by themselves, they chose the tomb of Ninus as their meeting place. Nearby, there was a fountain and a tall mulberry tree, abounding with white berries. In its dense shadows, they would find concealment. Ovid goes on to say, discreetly veiled, Thisbe unlocks her door, lets herself out, and slips into the darkness, emboldened by love. She finds a tomb and sits beneath the tree, but look, a lioness whose jaws are dripping from a recent kill approaches the fountain to assuage her thirst. The viewer, reclining in the biclinium of the house of Octavius Quartio, beheld an image in the context of a multi-sensory experience meant to trick him into believing that he occupied the same mythological world beyond time associated with the tragic lovers. As he lay on the couch, perhaps next to his own lover, he could hear the gurgle of the nymphaeum fountain in the lower garden, and sat surrounded in lush vegetation similar to that of the lovers. Along the looking pool, a statue of a lion mauling an antelope sat a few feet away, and the upper idicula, similar in form to a tomb, loomed in the distance. Thus, the occupant of the biclinium not only saw the narrative in the fresco above, but occupied the auditory and visual world in which it took place. The fresco located above the left-hand bench operated in a similar fashion. At the center of the image sits a partially nude youth of exceptional beauty, Narcissus. In front of the youth, occupying the foreground of the image, a pool of water reflects his image, one which will hold him spellbound, in love, with his own appearance until he fades away from longing. And here you can see that pool down below Narcissus where his own reflection looks back up at him. Here, the shared sensory experience is even more immediate for the viewer. Let's consider Ovid's description. There was a pool, clear, of reflecting water, unfrequented by shepherds with their flocks, or even grazing mountain goats. No bird, no beast, not even a fallen twig disturbed its surface. Its presence nourished greenery around it, and the surrounding trees would keep it cool. The biclinium, located immediately adjacent to the reflecting pool in the house of Octavius Quartio, provided a direct connection to the experience of Narcissus. The diner replicates the fault of Narcissus as he gazes into the distance and catches his own reflection. Note as well that certain details have been added to the fresco that go beyond Ovid's description. The addition of architectural elements, such as the column located above Narcissus' head, see that here, localize the myth not in an untouched or pristine wilderness, but in an articulated garden like that of the house of Octavius Quartio. A viewer will note that these images result not in the happy union of lovers, but in its self-destruction and tragedy. In choosing such narratives, Lucius was tapping into an aspect of visual culture associated with the Augustan Golden Age, where peace and prosperity are precarious and not assured. The fleeting nature of happiness served as a major theme in Ovid's work as well. And the leisure in which the diner reclined could be shattered by reality at any moment. In other words, one's presence in the atemporal lacus amoenus is precarious, and the world beyond hovers close by. This tension between reality and illusion is a key aspect of Ovid's program within the Metamorphoses. As John Biagio Conte notes, the fundamental characteristic of the world described by the Metamorphosis is its ambiguous and deceptive nature, the uncertainty of the realities between boundary and appearance, between the concreteness of things and the inconsistency of their appearance. Although the frescoes of the biclinium may lack in technical skill with regard to their representation of realistic anatomy and the depiction of convincing three-dimensional space, in choosing themes intertwined with the architectural and horticultural setting of the garden of the house of Octavius Quartio, as well as ones that subtly engaged the other frescoes in the sculpture, the painter of the biclinium created a similar illusory effect for the viewer as the one that Ovid constructed for his reader. Thus, we should view these frescoes not as an inferior product, but rather as a series of frescoes that engage the viewer in powerfully different ways than the imitation of reality. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I get the immense pleasure of handing over the slides and the microphone to my colleague, Professor Edward Dandro, who's going to speak to us today about public entertainment in Pompeii.
Thank you very much. Give me 1 second. All right, thank you very much, Dr. Vanderpoppen. Thank you, everyone else who made this possible and has given me the opportunity to present today. Today, I want to talk about public entertainment in Pompeii, and we're going to begin talking about the landscape of public entertainment very briefly, and then hone in on talking about gladiators and the gladiatorial experience in Pompeii. So when we were talking about Pompeii and I was given the opportunity to speak, I initially wanted to talk about the landscape of public entertainment in general. After all, Pompeii was a seaside town and sailors came in, not just to sell their goods, but also for entertainment. People from the countryside likewise came in for entertainment. Pompeii has theaters, it has taverns that were frequented. It has restaurants, brothels. If you've been there, you know the brothels have a central place in Pompeian life. And then the amphitheater, which seems sort of like a second thought because it's pushed to the far end, if you will, of the city. But the fact of the matter is that it is an old structure. The amphitheater itself was built sometime probably around 80 or 70 BC, and initially made of wood and then eventually converted over to stone to be a much more permanent structure. So it and a few others anticipate or precede, if you will, the very famous Flavian amphitheater or the Colosseum in Rome. The Colosseum, the amphitheater itself became a focal point for not just public entertainment, but also as a means of community building in the sense that most of the citizens and foreigners alike came together and in that space communicated with one another while watching gladiatorial combat and other events as well. So much as people make the forum or the public square, if you will, the centerpiece of community building and community communication, not everyone is brought there at exactly the same time. The amphitheater sat roughly between 12 and 20,000 people. It is a matter of some debate, but needless to say, this puts Pompeii as being a sizable town. A city, that's a matter of judgment. A town, definitely within the Roman system. It is unique in its structure. It's one of the very few amphitheaters that do not have an underground level. Although technologically speaking, it is just as advanced as others. It has a velarium, which is a cloth covering to cover the opening above the amphitheater, much in the same way as we have closed roofs, dome stadiums today where the roof can be opened and closed and things like that. This serves as the precursor of that. So the amphitheater is central to Pompeian civic life. Within the amphitheater we get the gladiators and gladiatorial combat. Just so we have an understanding, we can see, for example, the aerial layout of Pompeii. It is a sizable town. To the lower left is where we will see the gladiatorial barracks or the House of the Gladiators, along with theaters. And this along one of the main roads through the city itself. And of course, you can see Vesuvius in the background. The amphitheater itself was built into the soil. So it was dug up. It was built along a hillside, and the hillside was reformed, if you will. You can see that some of the material is missing. That's because people used it as a quarry at some point. Also that given the opportunity to lay out all the seats, you can see that a vast majority of the town's population could fit in there at any particular moment. Now, I'm going to talk about what goes on in the amphitheater briefly, but before that, I want to talk about a few other things. Now, firstly, the idea of the amphitheater. We frequently associate it with the city of Rome, but the fact of the matter is that it became, it was exported out of Italy throughout much of the Mediterranean. And while most of the amphitheaters are found in the west or the western portion of the Mediterranean, they are nonetheless found throughout the entire Roman Empire. And this over the course of 3 centuries. Unfortunately, Pompeii doesn't get to participate in that, how would you say, that imperial expansion, or the expansion of imperial culture that occurs after 79. So we're looking at a culture now, not just something that's very particular to Pompeii or particular to Rome, but we're looking at a culture now that's particular to the entire Mediterranean. And so understanding Pompeii gives us this nice opportunity to understand the layout of the amphitheater and how it operates and how it connects into the social life of its citizens and things like that. And this can allow us to create generalizations about how amphitheaters elsewhere and how public entertainment and gladiatorial combat in specific fit into their respective communities. Now, the House of the Gladiators is a second building that makes up the landscape of public entertainment. It was a villa at one time, then converted over to being a gladiatorial barracks. You can see on the lower left-hand side a sort of mapping out. We have the peristyle that goes around, and within the yard itself that served as a the training base. We have cells that the gladiators were locked up in. And then on the second floor on the east side, which I believe is what you are seeing there, that no longer survives, is where the lanista, or the owner / manager of the gladiators and the gladiatorial schools, so to speak, would reside. And beneath him, of course, if you've been there, there are some what you would refer to as jail cells below. This served a special function that I'll talk about briefly later on. Now, it's important to understand, and we can see this here. There are the cells. You can see how small they are and how uniform they are. And then also, just on the other side of the wall, where you see on the left-hand side people standing high above the cells, is the theater. And around in 62 AD, there was an earthquake, and after 62, the theater was incorporated into the training facility for gladiators. And so that space that you see there that is sort of wet and covered in water is an area in which gladiators would also practice, and as well as the stage itself. So this is also another example of how in some sense, the high culture of theater that we normally attach, the idea of high culture is supplanted by popular culture, or what the upper class Romans would describe as lowbrow entertainment. And that is gladiatorial combat. So, these are living spaces, these are fluid spaces, and we can see that after 62, that the theater is incorporated. Now, as I just mentioned, these are lived spaces, and within these spaces, human beings experience things. And so it's important to understand just what gladiators, whether new or experienced, go through in the gladiatorial school. So I'm going to do a kind of overview. Some of you probably have some background in in the history of gladiators and gladiator culture, but for a vast majority of you, this is probably new material. So I will address that very quickly. The first thing you need to understand is the demographic composition of the gladiators and basically the employees there. A vast majority of them are slaves. They have been purchased for the purpose of being trained as gladiators and for the business to profit off them. Secondly, we have criminals. Criminals who commit capital crimes are sometimes sent to be gladiators with an understanding that they are going to be placed in situations that will kill them. But for a vast majority of criminals, what we refer to as petty criminals and things like that, they could work off either all or part of their sentences serving as gladiators. And this is fairly important. But the thing that really catches attention of scholars and those who are fans of gladiators is the fact that people volunteer to be gladiators. Free individuals give up their free status, so to speak, to become gladiators. Now, the reason for this is well, it depends on the individual, but a lot of it has to do with the pursuit of celebrity or the pursuit of wealth. Gladiators don't make a lot of money, but one could have a signing bonus and acquire a fair amount of money up front, so to speak. So let's say your family's sort of, having some hard times. You sell yourself as a gladiator, you get paid a certain amount of money. Your family can pay the rent now, and for the next 2 to 3 years, you serve as a gladiator. So, so those groups make up the gladiators. But regardless of the social position that they have in society, they all go through the same thing. In other words, they're stripped of their, in some sense, their respective identities, whether free or slave and things like that. They are all now owned by the Lanissa. They are all owned by the gladiatorial company. And then they all go through the same regimen and they experience the same type of lifestyle. And this is going to have significant benefits, if you will, to maintaining coherency within among the gladiators. Now, one of the interesting things about the site at Pompeii is that it is one of 3 surviving schools that we know of. There are probably 100 plus gladiatorial schools throughout the Mediterranean. One survives in Rome near the Colosseum. For a long time, the one at Pompeii was the second one. And then in 2011, ground penetrating radar found another one. And this one's really peculiar because it's in Carnuntum, which is about 45 miles east of Vienna, Austria. So this is right on the front, so to speak, or the boundary of the Roman Empire. And you can see an artist's reconstruction here. And the fact of the matter is that this looks very similar to what we see in Pompeii, with a central courtyard that would have had a wooden structure where individuals would compete with one another. That wooden structure does not survive at Pompeii. You can see the various cells. You can see the cells on the second floor, which do not survive at Pompeii. And then, of course, you would have the Lanista living in the larger quarters. So Carnuntum sort of provides us, in some sense, a map of comparison. And as I said, this is a recent discovery since 2011. There has been no attempts to excavate it whatsoever, but it was found through ground penetrating radar. And now they're thinking of starting to excavate it just to see what they find there. So in terms of training, there is a system in place, a kind of culture of training that many of the schools share. And that is that all of these individuals start off as novices. The term in Latin is tiro, and then specific attention is paid to them. Some will be trained in certain styles of fighting. Some might branch out and embrace multiple styles of fighting, but in general, everyone specializes in at least one form of fighting. In addition to this, there are specialists that are assigned to oversee the physical fitness, oversee their health and their diet. These in Latin are referred to as doctores. We get our word doctor from there. And in addition to this, their daily lives are controlled by their teachers called magistri. And these teachers are usually ex-gladiators, older gladiators or retired, or people who have worked through their contracts or worked to acquire their freedom and purchase their freedom, end up working back at the same place where they once were gladiators, and then they communicate, if you will, the wisdom and knowledge that they previously had. Daily training was rough. It involved lots of fighting, lots of physical education, if you will, ranging anywhere from gymnastics to a type of martial arts, to how would you say, increasing stamina through running and whatnot. That occurred on a regular basis. Punishment could be flogging, it could be whipping, it could be being beaten, it could be thrown in a cell and stayed there, starvation, whatever, if you didn't abide by the rules or if you were slacking off. So much of their lives are controlled 24 hours a day. And in addition to this, much like modern society, where you have this idea of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, in which the eyes are always looking upon the prisoners. The same thing is true in these gladiatorial schools. So they're constantly keeping measurements of weight, measurements of performance and whatnot. So there is significant record keeping that goes on here, in which the various, various data is accumulated and maintained in records. And this does include the physical aspects of each gladiator, but also includes their victories and losses, who they won against, who they lost against, and the type of fighting, et cetera, and so on. So if you're used to, say, statistics in baseball today, where they have a stat for everything, the Romans maintained a fairly high level of statistical record. In circuses, the chariot races, it's even more complicated. But nonetheless, so they maintain strict records for these people as well. One of it was difficult to maintain friends, and it's difficult to maintain a sense of community as people die and get old and retire, and new people come in. It's sort of like military units in a way, where, you know, you have this constant influx of new and the outflow of old. So it was difficult to create a sense of community, but nonetheless, gladiators did that, and it's actually fairly important. Individuals who were trained in the same form of fighting would tend to form cliques or groups and each member would look out for one another. And to give themselves a sense of normalcy, they used the term familia. And they would refer to the other members of their group as family or family members. And this also extended abstractly to other gladiators. So the experience of the gladiator became a sort of glue that created this initially artificial community, and then this community became an affective community, one based on emotion. And so the reason why we have evidence for this is that when we look at, for example, funerary inscriptions of gladiators, we can see that very frequently other gladiators are the ones who are given the responsibility for setting up those inscriptions. If an ex-gladiator, retired, assuming, dies and doesn't have a wife or doesn't have children, or has a wife and children but doesn't have the money, his familia, his gladiatorial familia, will pay for his tombstone and for his burial. So we are dealing with a very strong bond between these individuals that comes from not just a shared experience of being a gladiator, but over time, the development of affective relations, that is, loving relations between these men. In terms of the types of gladiators, there are various types. The most popular is the Mormillo. If you see the image on the left-hand side, he has a caged helmet, a large shield, a short sword. This is very commonly depicted both in ancient art and in modern cinema or modern television. This is the individual that defines it. The Thryx is defined by a smaller shield and a curved sword called I believe it's called the Sica. The Retiarius, most of you, if you've seen the movie Spartacus, this is one. It's a guy who has a fishing net and a trident. We have the Secutor, who has a really strange relationship in gladiatorial combat because he's sort of the halftime or the second half gladiator who chases after wounded and injured fighters and dispatches them as he comes in fresh. So he has significant advantage. He's identified by a helmet with only 2 little holes in it, so it makes it difficult to breathe. The Hoplomachus, which is modeled on the ancient Greek hoplites, although it's sort of a mixture of Macedonian and Greek infantry, and then the Eques, people who fight on horse. That being said, there are an enormous number of other gladiators who fight in special forms or special formats. In Pompeii, we even have evidence for if you excuse me for 1 second, for charioteers, in which they ride on chariots and have spears and things like that. This is a very rare unit, but nonetheless, it is fairly common. Now, Pompeii offers us an opportunity to actually see a lot of the armature that gladiators wore. You can see the basket helmet here. You can see it's highly decorated. So a lot of money was invested in the gladiators, not just to arm them, but also in their appearance. to either make them intimidating or in a sense to show off the wealth of their patrons. And so we can see that, there is a type of bronze narrative being told on this. And we can see part of it from this side as well. And it looks a lot like the military, the type of imagery that you see in the military. We have victory, we have a trophy, we have someone bound up, a prisoner of war, things like that. So in a sense, the gladiators take on this kind of military symbolism. The Thracian helmet is typically defined by having a griffin on top. It has a cage, yes, but it has that griffin on top. The helmet of the secutor, you can see here. This is a repaired helmet. You can see the plate over the other side. Normally it's hammered out to being a single piece of metal. And then greaves. Even the greaves were decorated. Here we have leg greaves with Jupiter and Neptune on them, gods that the individual probably tapped into or hoped was overseeing his competition. Now, just to sort of conclude and wrap this up in a sense, that the games themselves were organized in long in advance, and they were structured in a way in which individuals could go through and basically see what they wanted to see on a particular day, and that is animal hunts in the morning, and you can see the example here. Whether Pompeii or elsewhere, the more exotic the animal, the more appealing it was. So elephants, lions, bears, things like that. But even creatures from sub-Saharan Africa or India, tigers and giraffes, for example, were popular. The Meridiani, which were public executions that occurred at noon, they were a lot of fun, to say the least. They're frequently reenactments of myths, although the images here show animals just basically eviscerating tied up individuals. These are later, these do not come from Pompeii. And then gladiatorial combat. This is a fresco from one of the houses. I believe Dr. Zaho will probably or possibly touch upon it, who knows. The answer is no. So I can nicely utilize it, in which we have a bleeding gladiator. But this plays into the larger issue that I'm going to touch upon just very quickly and wrap this up. And that is that gladiators pervaded, and the discussion of gladiators pervaded public and private spaces. In terms of graffiti, both the gladiators themselves used graffiti as a way of communicating and commemorating, but also the fan base. And this is something that we need to understand, is that many people throughout the community had their respective gladiators that they cheered on. And a lot of this graffiti is usually written on public buildings and things like that. Needless to say, some of it is rather colorful language in the way that they describe what someone does to someone else. Then we can see frescoes, for example, within the private domain, in which this is the equivalent of a Green Bay Packers fan throwing down a Green Bay Packers rug on their, on their floor, so to speak, or a picture of Aaron Rodgers on their wall. So we can see here that frescoes or the wall paintings of the elite even maintained interest in gladiatorial combat. And then, of course, the very famous painting of the amphitheater of Pompeii, in which this also served as someone's private art that they took great pride in. So gladiators pervade all aspects of society. The sport itself captures the public's attention, and a material culture develops, an industry develops that not just focuses on the fighting, but also the promotion and advertisement of these respective of this respective sport, if you will. So I went a little bit long. I do apologize, and I do apologize to Dr. Zaho, but I'm going to hand this over to her now. So Dr. Zaho.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Dandro. Let me share my screen with you. There. I'd like to, again, thank the Orlando Science Center, to also Dr. Illenia Colón for hosting, as well as my colleagues, Dr. Vanderpoppen and Dr. Dandro. So I will try and move us along a little bit so we can leave some time at the end for questions. So I greet you, I say hello, or as they might have greeted each other in Pompeii, salve. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about cultural heritage and preservation at Pompeii, what's happened in the past and what currently is happening on site. The current state of conservation and preservation at Pompeii is both disheartening and promising. And like so many things at Pompeii, that's changed little since it was rediscovered. Today, Pompeii, along with its neighbors, Herculaneum and Torre Annunziata, is designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. UNESCO stands for United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It was awarded this distinction on December 6, 1997, based on 3 cultural criteria. And I'm not going to go through all of that for you, but I wanted you to see that they're there, and I'll sort of move through this quickly. To be included on the World Heritage List, a site must be deemed of outstanding universal value and meet at least 1 of 10 selection criteria. Pompeii actually received its place on the list by meeting at least 3 of these. Pompeii meets criterion 3, to bear a unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or to a civilization which is living or which has disappeared. It meets criteria number 4, to be an outstanding example of a type of building, architectural or technological ensemble or landscape, which illustrates a significant stage in human history. And it meets criterion 5, to be an outstanding example of a traditional human settlement of land use or sea use, which is representative of a culture or cultures, or human interaction with the environment, especially when it has become vulnerable under the impact of irreversible damage or change. These archaeological sites are all located within a geographical area where the risks of earthquakes and, yes, volcanic eruptions is high. Population density and modern building expansion over the last 40 years have contributed to compromising the historical archaeological qualities of sites and distorting the traditional landscape and identity of the region itself. These are just some of the distinctions that have allowed for these cities to be considered a World Heritage Site, and by earning that designation, it might help to ensure their conservation and preservation for future generations. The problem is that conservation and preservation issues have plagued particularly Pompeii since the day it was rediscovered. A brief survey of the early period of activity on the site proves the varying progresses and issues. The site of Pompeii was initially discovered in 1592 by Domenico Fontana, though it really didn't begin to be excavated or explored until 1748. And I'm showing you here a portrait of Domenico Fontana, and he may be familiar to some of you. He's a high Renaissance or Baroque Roman architect who's responsible for erecting the obelisks all over Rome, particularly the one in the middle of St. Peter's Square. Even at that point in 1748, excavators thought they were digging at a city called Stabia. It wasn't even until 1763, with the discovery of an inscription on a wall fragment reading Pompeia, did the city rightfully claim its name. Unfortunately, 18th century excavations were more like treasure hunting than archaeological excavation. Digging began in the areas of Via Stabia and Via Nola and near the amphitheater, which I'm showing you here. It was always recognizable, but these excavations were deemed unencouraging. In 1755, that's Charles III of Spain. In 1755, the excavations at Pompeii were led by Roque Joaquin Alcubierre, a Spaniard, who initiated a more systematic exploration, including documentation, drawings, and keeping excavation journals. He worked at the service of King Charles III of Spain, who I'm showing you here. During Charles's reign, the practice at Pompeii was that once a room had been discovered, it was pillaged. It was pillaged for the art and objects inside, and the discoveries were then presented to him to be selected for his private collection. Any remaining objects were then destroyed, quote, in order to protect them from falling into the wrong hands, end quote. When frescoes were discovered, they were stripped from the walls, framed, and then hung in the king's gallery or palace, and the rooms then reburied. When descriptions of this type of pillaging reached outside Italy, there was considerable outrage and protest until King Charles finally had to call off the practice. In 1771, the German art historian Joachim Winckelmann wrote a scathing account of what he witnessed at Herculaneum and Pompeii. The account comes from an essay he penned entitled A Critical Account of the Situation and Destruction of Herculaneum, Pompeii, and Stabia. He wrote, quote, the direction of this work was given to a Spanish engineer called Roque Joaquin Alcubierre, who had followed His Majesty to Naples. This man, who, to use the Italian proverb, knew as much of antiquities as the moon does of lobsters, has been, through his want of capacity, the occasion of many antiquities being lost. So obviously, Winckelmann was not a fan. Unfortunately, for the rest of the 18th century, the excavations continued to be aimed mostly at discovering objects, murals, mosaics, and statues, and not recording or preserving history. With the arrival of French rule in Naples, from 1799 to 1815, the techniques, ideas, and plans for excavation changed radically. It was in this period, in part due to the interests of Caroline Bonaparte, you see her here, she was the sister of Napoleon, and she was the wife of Joachim Murat, who was then named King of Naples, that Pompeii begins to be systematically excavated. A system was also begun in which sections of the site were connected to create a kind of continuous itinerary for visitors and guests. It was also during this period that the city gates were excavated, and with them some of the major roads. At this time, circa 1810 or so, there were over 1,500 workers on the site at Pompeii. Under the following Bourbon rule and in light of lack of funds and resources, advancement slowed, but discoveries were made of some of the most impressive homes, including the House of the Tragic Poet, the House of the Tragic Poet, the House of Castor and Pollux, and the House of Meleager, and others. I'm just showing you scenes from the interior of the House of the Tragic Poet. In 1860, the appointment of Giuseppe Fiorelli as director of excavations at Pompeii by the newly crowned King of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele II, was a game changer. In addition to also serving as the director of the Naples Archaeological Museum and starting a training school on site for archaeologists, Fiorelli cleared away mounds of debris from earlier excavations and immediately constructed roofs over all exposed areas. As director, Fiorelli also changed the methods of excavating spaces at Pompeii. Previous procedures involved first digging a road or long trench and then tunneling up into rooms and houses from beneath the floors. Fiorelli and his teams instead began excavating spaces from the top down, better preserving floors, mosaics, and the room's contents. Another way Fiorelli established order at the site was to divide the town into reggios, insulae, and entrances, or basically regions, blocks, and house numbers. I'm showing you, I know it's hard to read the map, but you can at least see this is the layout of the 9 regions of Pompeii, right? And you see that they're numbered with Roman numerals, and they're of course still in use today. He established 9 reggio, or regions, numbered 1 through 9 using Roman numerals. Each reggio was then divided into insulae, or blocks. He also numbered the towers at Pompeii, starting with the letter T and then 1 through 12, and left gates identified by their names. This organization of space helped tremendously in organizing and identifying spaces within the city for both excavators and visitors. For example, a space could now easily be identified using this system, so that Roman numeral 2.4.6 translates to region 2, block 4, entrance 6. In this case, that would be the house of Julia Felix, or the villa of Julia Felix. And you see the courtyard peristyle from Julia Felix and one of the frescoes from that structure. More than establishing an ordered numbering system, it was Fiorelli who invented the method of pumping plaster into the subterranean cavities formed by dead bodies. And I'm showing you here just a diagram of how this works, right? And then one of Fiorelli's casts. Called calchi in Italian, these plaster casts of the bodies of the city's residents, human and animal, brought the humanity and tragedy of the events at Pompeii to the fore. People could see and understand how people had died, what they were doing, what they were wearing, and how frightening it must have been. These casts, still so intriguing, helped shift public opinion about Pompeii from a simple archaeological site to a city preserved in time. Fiorelli's successors would, for the next 50 years, follow his example and excavate much of the city and continue to make plaster casts. Excavations continued, becoming more systematic and scientific and less treasure hunting-like throughout the early 20th century. Major finds were better recorded, and frescoes and mosaics were actually left in situ. Between 1924 and 1961, the director was Amedeo Maiuri. He was handpicked by Mussolini, but that's another lecture. He, in addition to the discovery of the cave of the Cumaean Sibyls on the edge of the city, began to excavate in stratigraphic layers, surveying actually below the 79 AD level of the city to its more ancient foundations. Perhaps one of the most catastrophic events at Pompeii, since that fated volcanic eruption, occurred during his tenure as director. In the fall of 1943, the Allied forces were fighting to dislodge German soldiers and disrupt supply routes in southern Italy. Some of the roads, bridges, and overpasses were close to and part of the site of Pompeii. A series of bombings in that area, part of a campaign called Operation Avalanche, involving American and British troops, struck the site of Pompeii, damaging and destroying a number of buildings, including portions of the Forum, the museum, and others. Ironically, many of the recent restoration at Pompeii, particularly over the last 30 years, has not been to new structures discovered at Pompeii, but to repairing structures damaged in World War II. Just 7 months later, on March 17th, 1944, Mount Vesuvius erupted again. The eruption lasted 10 days, and the volcano covered some of the neighboring areas with 3 feet of ash, and in some cases hurled basketball-sized rocks at them. The small town of San Sebastiano had to be evacuated due to lava flows. Then in 1981, a large earthquake hit the area and did more damage. Finally, in 1997, Pompeii was enrolled on the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites, and it seemed then that some more attention would be paid to the crumbling conditions at the site, and that real conservation and preservation progress would be made. But that didn't happen. In 2008, conditions were deemed so bad at the site that the Italian government declared the site in a state of emergency. The harsh reality of that declaration revealed itself in November of 2010 when the House of the Gladiators collapsed in a heap of rubble. The building, as pointed out by Dr. Dandro, was used as a place for training and gathering gladiators, some against their will and some not. It was also used as a storehouse for weapons. It had been decorated with mosaics and frescoes depicting military themes. Conservators salvaged what they could from the lower sections of the wall. And I'm showing you a photo prior to the collapse in 2010 showing these winged victories, and then here a portion of the repaired fresco afterward. Though it had been closed to the public for some time, it likely collapsed due to a combination of neglect and recent heavy rains. That said, it was not even on the list of buildings that the management of the site had deemed at risk. In 2012, the Italian government launched Il Grande Progetto Pompeii, the Grand Plan for Pompeii, allocating 105 million euros to address a number of the key concerns at the site. One of the first challenges was determining which of the critical issues to address first. In no particular order, the issues at Pompeii are the 3 million plus visitors per year to the site, aging and decaying past restorations, light exposure, wild dogs, pigeons, wear and tear, graffiti, tourists rubbing and touching frescoes, theft, vandalism, poor signage, eroding floors, invasive vegetation, inadequate roofing systems, inadequate water management, not to mention the lack of funding, understaffing, untrained staff, and lax security. You can see the issues are considerable. Considerable time and money is also needed to simply undo some of what was done in the past. All had been done with good intentions, but now proving to be problematic. For example, in the early 20th century, the use of volcanic pumice stone in the mixtures used to create gravel to enhance the floors throughout the site turned out to be far too porous for that purpose, and were then permitting water infiltration and the oxidation of iron frameworks, now causing the structures to collapse. Another issue was a new type of concrete that was mixed with asbestos, now known to be a very toxic substance. Visitor impact, what's known in the anthropological world as anthropic pressures, and inadequate visitor management is at least 50% of the current issues at Pompeii. The simple act of visiting the site, coupled with the unintentional rubbing or scraping of bags and backpacks against walls, leaning, standing, sitting, selfies, etc., splashing water on mosaics and frescoes to get a better view, flash photography, writing on walls, and theft all prove incredibly destructive. This collecting of small souvenirs, or rather the theft of pieces of Pompeii, has been going on for as long as visitors have been coming to the site. The practice is both illegal and destructive. Interestingly, in the last 50 years or so, there's been a kind of awakening to the problem, particularly by those who commit the acts themselves. In October of 2020, a Canadian tourist, identified only as Nicole, sent a package containing 2 mosaic tiles, parts of an amphora, and a piece of ceramics to a travel agent in Pompeii. In the package, she included a letter asking them to be returned to the site and expressing her regret for having taken them in her youth. She also claimed that they were cursed. She essentially blamed all of her misfortunes since the time she took them on taking them. She stated, quote, "I wanted to have a piece of history that couldn't be bought." She also stated that she was young and dumb at the time. In addition to all the destructive forces previously mentioned, there's another perhaps less publicized issue, and one often discussed in hushed tones. That is the bombs. Allied forces are reported to have dropped 165 bombs on Pompeii in 9 different air raids during the Second World War. 96 bombs have since been located and deactivated. It's clear that others have ended up in parts of the archaeological site that perhaps have not yet been excavated. Currently, there is a mapping project to determine where the ones discovered were found, and considerable effort to find the rest. And here's part of that mapping project showing you, as you can see from the legend, documenting exploded bombs found throughout the site and the shaded areas where there are likely others. Part of what's difficult is that the site of Pompeii covers over 170 acres, and only 2/3 of that have ever been excavated. Antonio De Simone, an archaeology professor at the University of Naples, who had encountered some unexploded bombs during his excavation of Pompeii in the late 1980s, said, quote, "We were there with our chisels and shovels, slowly lifting a handful of earth at a time, and suddenly we found the bombs under our feet." He told the newspaper Il Fatto, "There were 2 of them. One had already exploded and was reduced to fragments. The other, unfortunately, had not. It was perfectly intact." There is good news, however. It sounded like a real bummer kind of lecture up to then, didn't it? According to all accounts from the Italian government, UNESCO, scientists, archaeologists, and even recent visitors, the Grand Pompeii project has been an incredible success. All of the issues facing the site have been carefully considered by several different teams working on site, and almost all of the various issues listed have either been addressed, solved in some cases, or continue to be evaluated, monitored, and addressed in some way. According to Massimo Ossana, director of the Archaeological Park of Pompeii, the Great Pompeii Project, quote, secured the entire archaeological area, restored and reopened entire areas, buildings and streets denied to the public for too long. Perhaps he's overly ambitious, but helpful. Pompeii is now incomparably better condition than it was in the past. For example, in 2010, less than 15% of the excavated area was accessible to tourists, and only 10 buildings were open, in comparison to 64 that were open in 1956. Today, around 70% of the uncovered city is accessible, and more than 30 fully restored buildings can be visited. Another development from the project was the creation of a 3.5-kilometer long pathway along the main streets of the ancient city for mobility impaired visitors. This path, also great for parents with small children or children in strollers, provides safe access to parts of the site that were previously impossible to reach. And many of you, I'm sure, have been to Pompeii and can attest to how difficult it is to navigate the site when you're not mobility impaired. But perhaps the most spectacular and unexpected benefit from the success of the Grand Pompeii project are the new discoveries. These discoveries include new roads, homes, large and small, and additional bodies. In 2018, conservation work in Region 5, an area sort of wedged between the Via del Vesuvio and the Via di Nola, and covering an area roughly half an acre square, proved to be incredibly fruitful. One of the first discoveries made there was a previously unknown area now called the Alley of the Balconies. The alley is actually a narrow street lined with grand houses, some of which feature large second-floor balconies and rich decoration. One of the surviving terraces still had terracotta jars for wine and oil laying on their sides, probably left outside on someone's balcony to dry. Also found in Region 5 were several homes, some with small enclosed courtyards and gardens, each decorated with fantastic wall paintings and mosaics. One of the homes revealed a small semi-enclosed courtyard, about 16 by 12 feet, with a decorated lararium. A lararium is a shrine dedicated to the household gods called lares, and you see them flanking this small shrine here. These were guardian deities that protected the family and were worshipped in the home, usually in the entryway or in a courtyard. This is Massimo Ossana just after the discovery, and I think you can see the brilliance of the colors. The niche for the shrine is shown here, flanked by twin images of the lares. On the wall below the niche are two large serpents, generally symbolizing prosperity and good luck, and a pedestal topped with food and offerings. Here's a large pine cone and other offerings. On the floor below rests a small stone altar that bears traces of burnt offerings. The room where this fresco was found has been nicknamed the Enchanted Garden Room. Another spectacular find comes from a small bedroom in a house excavated in the same area. A section of wall revealed a mural painting depicting the seduction of the Spartan queen Leda by the Greek god Zeus while in the form of a swan. The exceptional figure of the reclining semi-nude Leda, while in this amorous embrace, looks boldly out at the viewer. This in and of itself, art historically speaking, is unusual because though there are a number of images of Leda on the swan, in none of the Roman ones discovered thus far does she ever look out at the viewer. A more startling find in this area was the discovery of the remains of a group of people, including women and children, found huddled together in a room. Found with them were the remains of a small wooden box with bronze hinges that had been filled with charms, amulets, ornaments, and figurines. Some may have been worn as jewelry, while others may have served a decorative, magical, or apotropaic function. Found among the contents were intricately carved figurines of skulls and animals, small bronze bells, glass beads, mirrors, and pieces of glazed ceramics. Experts predict it will take several years to finish uncovering and then preserve and study these new discoveries. Currently, there are no new plans for any further excavation in any other areas in order to focus on the conservation of the new finds so that they can be shared with the public. Stefania Giudice, one of the lead conservators at the site, said it best, I think. She said, quote, "Excavations are like having children. You have to take care of them. You can't just abandon what you find and move on to the next thing. It's a real responsibility. My hope is that we've learned lessons from the past and will accept the responsibility of conserving and preserving Pompeii for future generations." Thank you. I will throw it now back to our host, Dr. Colón.
Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful presentations. So informative. And we do have questions already. What we're going to do is we're going to go over the questions we have and open it to other specific questions. Make sure you say who the question is for, which presenter. There's two related questions, and they're for Edward, and they're from Richard and Lauren. What defines winning and losing when gladiators compete? Did gladiators fight against each other always have to end in death? And those who volunteered be able to stop at any time? So those are that first set of questions for Edward.
Oh, you've got to unmute, Dr. Dandro.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay. So as I was saying, if you are a volunteer to be a gladiator, you signed a contract, and the Romans were big on enforcing contracts. So you were forced to work all the way through the agreed upon time. It could be 1 year, it could be 3, maybe up to 5, depending, but on average, usually between 1 and 3 years. In terms of the victory and losing and death, because they're all intertwined. In the first century AD, there were not a lot of gladiators that were killed. Roughly, it's estimated about 10% of gladiators died in gladiatorial combat. That is equivalent to the death rate on the battlefield in antiquity. So it is, pretty low, to say the least. Certainly much lower than even modern casualty or modern mortality rates in modern battlefields. It was about performance, and if both parties performed well, in other words, even the loser fought and showed skill and pluck and bravery and everything else like that, it's very likely that that individual survived. Some deaths resulted from accident. Some were purposeful, but once someone became too fatigued to fight, or maybe slipped and fell and found themselves at a significant disadvantage, then it went to the judge, the summa iudice, who could decide it, and frequently did. Also, there was a culture, an economic investment culture. People paid a lot of money to train these individuals. And so to have them die, so to speak, either early in their career or worse, as experienced gladiators, was seen as a major, major financial hit. And if a gladiator died, the host of the games usually had to pay somewhere around 10 times as much for the cost of the gladiator. So even the host of the games would make sure that most of the gladiators survived. Now that does radically change in the 2nd and especially 3rd centuries AD, but Pompeii doesn't survive into those time periods. By the 3rd century, it is roughly about 25% of all people who lose are killed in battle or killed in combat. So, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Edward. So our next question is for Robert, and it is if you could talk a little bit about sort of comparable size of, let me see, where did the question go? The house of Octavius.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So the house itself is somewhere in between 3,000 and 4,000 square feet. So think a very large Winter Park mansion in terms of the house size. The garden itself occupies about 2/3 of an acre. So this is a little bit larger than half of a football field. So that should help contextualize the space a little bit in terms of things that you can envision.
Thank you so much. Then we have a lot of questions for Dr. Zaho. I don't know if you could read them there in the question and answer. So the first one, let's see.
I see. I'm sorry. Are plaster casts still used today? If so, what circumstances would allow this? As I understand, yes, right? They're still using what's now termed the Fiorelli method, right, of pumping plaster into cavities, subterranean cavities, in order to preserve them, right? It's deemed at this point sort of the best alternative. New techniques in archaeology are helping with ground penetrating radar to finding these cavities. It's become a more precise operation, but it is something that's still being used. I see a question from Linda. I thought Pompeii was discovered during a public works project in the early 1900s. I was surprised to hear that it was discovered in the 1500s. Oh, where can I find more literature about the early discoveries? There is a ton of literature about the early period in Pompeii. I don't know if we have a method to give you some citations. I have, I'm looking at footnotes that would give you some of the best of the early stuff. I'm happy to, in an email, right, send you a number of sources about Fiorelli's processes in the early period at Pompeii. Off the top of my head, I can't, but there's a ton of it, and I'm glad you were surprised, right? A lot of people are just surprised about just how early Pompeii was discovered. Right, in 1592, they knew it was there. They just didn't know what it was, and it took some time to actually get started. Prior to the discovery in the 18th century, was there general knowledge of the existence of Pompeii? There was recognition in early records that referred to the area around Pompeii, and particularly because the amphitheater was almost always visible, it was simply called La Civiltà, right? The civilization, or the city, as it's referred to in early documents. So they knew something was there until excavation started. And like I said, until an inscription actually confirmed what they were digging, right, in the middle of the 18th century, they didn't know what they had. And then as soon as they figured out it was Pompeii, of course, there's a great, there's a number of historic records, obviously Pliny's letter, the description of the eruption of Pompeii, verifies exactly where they were. So yeah, I hope that helps.
And we have another question that can be open to any of you. Is this, prior to the discovery in the 18th century, was there a general knowledge of the existence? Is that the one you did already? I apologize. And then we have another one for Dr. Dandro. How do we know the gladiators practice in the large theater after 62 AD? What evidence points to this occurring? And did the gladiators use the palestra next to the arena for practice before 62?
Yeah, that is correct. They did use the palestra. Here I rely on archaeological evidence and the conclusions of archaeologists that the earthquake of '62 resulted in the kind of reshaping of that particular area, and the two sites were incorporated. And you can see that also with the creation of archways that sort of connect the two areas together. But again, I'm relying on better experts here than me. So.
And we have an additional question for you. It's in the chat, and it says, who owned the gladiators' armor? Did it get passed to the next gladiator, and were there private patrons who sponsored them?
The company owned everything. Gladiators had the status of basically slaves. If they weren't slaves already, they became the status of a slave. Equipment did get passed from one gladiator to another, unless, of course, there was some form of, how do you say, I don't know, recognition that equipment was unlucky or something. Then I imagine that it was put to the side or whatnot. As for private patrons, yeah, that's a very complex issue. A number of the schools were funded by governments, local and imperial, and the gladiators themselves could have fans and probably did receive some gifts in the terms of food or, excuse the expression, sex. But for the most part, patrons usually patronized the school rather than individual gladiators. It was much more of a solid economic investment to do that, rather than just focus all your attention on gladiators themselves. But gladiators did attract a lot of attention. There's a lot of graffiti about upper class women fancying gladiators and providing them with plenty of gifts and things like that. So it depends on how you define patronage. Yeah, so.
Thank you so much. I would like to add to Dr. Zaho's has one more question. I'll get it for you.
I actually have a question for Dr.
Okay.
Dr. Vanderpoppen. Is that okay? Can I participate? I thought that the essays were fantastic. Two questions really. In terms of the house at Octavius Quartio, do we know enough about the owner and any of his personal situation that would help underscore the choices being made for the home? And then the other would be also, do we know enough, because I know there's a lot of paleobotany going on at Pompeii, particularly with the gardening, that the garden area was planted with things like narcissus and mulberry trees, right? Because and I also wonder too about if we knew enough, I wonder if there's not, because I think in terms of Renaissance frescoes, layers of meaning, so that you have presented this great sort of sensory aspect to what these frescoes might have been in terms of bringing people in. Are there also, or could there not also be, moral and allegorical messages involved in, I don't know, did his wife die? Was he kind of a jerk and a narcissist? You know, I mean, I wonder if there's moral and allegorizing things that relate to him and the family, although we may not know any of that.
Yeah, we don't know much about Octavius Quartio himself. We can do this better in the House of the Vetii, where we know a little bit more about the Vetii. And I have not seen where people have tried this kind of moralizing reading of the frescoes in the House of Octavius Quartio. With regard to the paleobotany, this is one of the houses that has been studied paleobotanically. And in particular, there's a scholar who worked at Pompeii for years, Wilhelmina Jastrzębski, that used a different technique. She actually looked at the cross sections of the cavities that roots for the plants left. And you can actually see, based on the root structure and the way that the roots branch out, you can tell what plants were planted where in gardens at Pompeii. And work has been done following that technique to reconstruct some of these spaces. What we do have solid evidence for in that space is we've got solid evidence for a partial vineyard in there. It's much harder to get at smaller things like narcissus. And so we don't have as good of evidence for those plants that would have specifically interlocked, mulberry trees, the narcissus. I, in my fanciful imagination with no factual basis would love to imagine that these plants occupied that space. But again, this is a mere gut hunch without any confirmed evidence that backs it up.
Thank you.
And we have another question for Dr. Vanderpoppen. It says, well, what do we know about the class of Octavius's family? Is there evidence of social climbing? Is it perhaps the idea of the house is a copy of other villas? And they mentioned the idea sort of thinking about McMansions and Graceland.
Yeah, so folks who have studied this before, and in particular the work of one scholar, John Clark, likes to imagine Octavius Quartio in this fashion, that he's a new up-and-coming member of Pompeii's merchant class that is newly wealthy and participates in the expansion of villas that occurs in the 1st century AD as people begin to add these new accoutrements to the villa. And so this is somebody that, in the grand scheme of things, appears to be a new arrival, we imagine.
Thank you so much. And we have another question for Dr. Zaho. It says, how much of Pompeii has been excavated and how much more is still intact and preserved in its original state?
I gave at the end, I gave you the actual number of hectares, right? Basically areas. Roughly 30+% of those 170 acres are completely untouched as of yet. Though Pompeii, as I also tried to indicate, that the general consensus now through this the Grand Pompeii project is that no new excavating is being done at all until the issues that were pointed out that are plaguing Pompeii now can be at least slowed and addressed. I think that Massimo Ossana is one who deems that we sort of need to preserve and conserve what we're currently working with. Of course, then accidentally, when you sort of begin to find like the frescoes that were just discovered, you then excavate, but there's not any plans to do any more. The whole area of what is essentially Region 5, which is the northeast corner of Pompeii, is still the most under excavated of the whole of the site. And there's obviously there will be a great number of finds there, but I think that the plan currently is to hold off on doing that until tourist and management, I think, can be handled, right? Again, the biggest problem is 3.5 million tourists a year at Pompeii, and how do you balance, right, visitor interest and damage to that site. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much. I don't see that we have any more questions presently. And then we would like to thank everyone for their time and expertise, and certainly encourage you to go see Pompeii, the Immortal City. The plaster cast that you were speaking about, there's 2 of them in the exhibition. They're quite, wonderful. So thank you so much. I hope everybody enjoyed the symposium.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending.